This is the second video regarding our immigration module. So let's begin with our learning objectives for this video. There are four. First, I would like all of you to understand a little bit about the diversity of the new immigrants, especially in contrast to the old. I also want to put immigration into the United States into its global context. Third, we're going to describe the source areas for current immigration to the United States. And finally, I want to identify the top 5 source countries for current immigration to the United States. So let's begin by looking at the diversity of the new immigrants. And remember what this means. We're talking about the current period, which runs from 1965, when we changed and liberalized our immigration laws, all the way to the present. And that is then we're going to contrast the new immigrants with the so-called old immigrants, who largely arrived between 1850 or 1840 and about the 1920s. So first off, I'm hoping this is already pretty clear. There's great diversity of origins with regard to the new immigrants. In the case of comparing them, the old to the new, today there are quite literally hundreds of countries represented versus maybe about a dozen back during that time period of the old immigration between roughly 1850 and the 1920s. Today, every continent is well represented, whereas in the past it was primarily a unidirectional immigration from Europe into the United States. Now what this means is that the new immigrants are much more diverse with regard to these 3 categories. There's more diversity with regard to ethnicity. So whereas 150 years ago, you might have had the ethnic diversity represented by Germans, Swedes, and Italians, today we have Colombians, Azerbaijanis, Russians, Poles, and also people from Brazil. So it runs the entire global range. That also, of course, means that there's much more diversity of language. So we've got, just to give you one really excellent example, in the New York City public school systems, it's understood that about 100 different languages are spoken by the students. They're obviously as well learning English, but 100 different languages are spoken at home. In fact, probably even a few more. And this also means that there's more diversity today with regard to religion among the new immigrants. The old immigrants were largely Christian or Jewish, and there's more diversity today. Just to give an example of that, there are immigrants coming from North Africa who are largely Muslim, from India who may be Hindu, and from, let's say, South Korea who may be Buddhist or possibly something else associated with the wide range of religions that are practiced in East Asia. Now, one interesting point about the immigration to the United States is that a lot of people are under the false impression that it's all about Mexico. Whenever somebody talks about immigrants, the immediate image that pops into their head is, oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about immigrants from Mexico. Well, yes, Mexico is important because it does constitute, in fact, in terms of source areas, the largest share. But look at how tiny the share of the overall foreign-born population that actually comes from Mexico is. It's just under 30%, which means about 70% are coming from places other than Mexico, whether it's Haiti or Cuba or France. There's a lot of other national groups represented. Mexico just happens to be the one country that in fact does have the largest share. Here is another way that the new immigrants are much more diverse than the old immigrants. There is much wider range, or is a much wider range, I should say, with regard to education and skills. The old immigrants were largely displaced peasants. They worked the land, and some of them were middle-class artisans and shopkeepers, but most were basically displaced people who worked the land. Today you still have that, but you also have, for example, professionals. In fact, 33% of the new immigrants who currently live in the United States are already professional upon arrival to the United States. They already have a college degree. They maybe even have a master's degree and they're well credentialized. Many of those people actually arrive with a special visa, which is basically a government document which allows you to become an American citizen relatively easily. It's called an H-1B visa. The majority are working class, and what we might call them are labor migrants. So a classic example might be a mechanic who comes from Mexico, in part because of the big wage differential between the United States and Mexico. So move 500 miles to the north and you'll make 4 times as much money doing the same work. But it's largely a working class immigration. 5% are entrepreneurial, meaning the small businessmen and women. They own gas stations and Baskin-Robbins and small shops all across the United States. And then finally, we do have a new category. This new category is only found in the post-1965 period, and it's a reflection of how we changed our laws. We created a new category of immigrants that are referred to here as political refugees or asylees. They constitute about 10% of the overall foreign-born population in the United States. And essentially what they are people who are claiming that they may be persecuted or even killed in their homeland. And so they're coming to the United States as basically refugees. A really good example would be Cubans here in the United States who are escaping the Castro government, or maybe Iranians who were escaping the country of Iran after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Big point though, if you contrast this with the old immigration, there's more educational and skills diversity. Now, I briefly want to look at this map because what it shows is annual net immigration, or migration as it's called here. Don't worry, we're not going to make a distinction about the difference between those two terms, to each one of the main world regions, and of course over here is North America. So let's just look at that for now. North America includes both the United States and Canada, so we can't just talk about the United States, but the United States and Canada behave quite similarly with regard to immigration. Notice that there are many arrows going into the United States, and what that means is it is a place that's receiving a net positive inflow of international immigrants. But other places like Asia, all of the arrows are basically going in the other direction. That means Asia overall is a place that is in fact on the other side of the ledger. There's a net negative outflow of immigration from Asia to other parts of the world. Now what I want you to look at is the two biggest arrows coming into at least North America. They are from Asia and Latin America. And in fact, that kind of corresponds pretty nicely with what we've already said. We know the two biggest categories in terms of source areas are Asia and Latin America. The only difference is that when you include Canada, the Asian component is much higher. And so for just the United States, these two are actually the opposite, meaning the Latin American arrow is going to be larger than the Asian arrow. I've got another map that basically illustrates the exact same set of ideas. In this particular map, look carefully at the legend. The kind of maroonish colors mean you have a net positive immigration, meaning they're receiving immigrants. The blue, net negative. That means immigrants are leaving those places. Look just at the Americas and what do you see? It's going to make a lot of sense. Both the United States and Canada, they're both maroon. That means they're receiving a lot of immigrants. Most of Latin America is blue, which means those are places that the immigrants are basically leaving. Now, what this of course also means is we can kind of relate this to global north and global south. Generally speaking, the global north is receiving immigrants. The global south is the source area for immigrants. There are some exceptions. Japan, also a net negative outflow. That's primarily a reflection of the fact that Japan and Japanese society has not been very welcoming to immigrants for a variety of reasons. And there's also a distinction here if you look really carefully at Europe. Eastern Europe, net negative outflow. Western Europe, net positive. And what that means is that Eastern Europe, which is basically in the global south, is sending immigrants primarily to Western Europe, which is basically in the global north. So that pattern is holding at that different scale of analysis. Let's look really carefully at where immigrants have come to the United States over the course of the last few decades. In the year 2000, the percent of the foreign-born population in the United States was broken down nicely on this pie chart right here. Now, what I really want you to look at is this. Latin America represents just over half. That means that Latin America is the biggest source area for immigrants to the United States. Now, Latin America is a big place. You've got South America as a relatively tiny component, the Caribbean also a relatively tiny component. But it's Central America that constitutes the biggest share within that larger Latin American piece of the puzzle. This is, of course, where Mexico is found, and so it kind of stands to reason. But also notice this, Asia is also quite large. It's about a quarter or just over a quarter. So the two largest source areas for immigrants to the United States today, and really over the course of the entire post-1965 period, has been Latin America and Asia. Still, Europe is represented, but it's a comparatively smaller share. You also have a tiny slice from Africa, and then also from places that might in this case be understood as Canada, Northern America. Finally, what I want to do is look carefully at this. It shows us basically the top 10 source countries for the year 2000. And trust me, these numbers don't change very much over time. So for the year 2010, you're going to see the exact same list of countries. And all I want to do is I want to focus in on the top 5. So Mexico, followed by China, followed by the Philippines, followed by India and Vietnam. We will ignore Cuba, Korea, Canada, El Salvador, and Germany for our discussion right now. Notice this, Mexico, it's the number 1, 29.5%. That means that 29.5% of the foreign-born population in the United States was born in Mexico. Then about 5% was born in China, about 4% in the Philippines, 3% in India, 3% in Vietnam, and that then rounds out our top 5 list. So, what does this mean? Well, first, look for the pattern. It's basically Asia and also Latin America. In the case of Mexico, which is a Latin American country, and of course all of the others are basically Asian countries. No big surprise. But there is one final thing that I want to do. I want to talk about why each one of these that makes it into the top 5 as source countries for immigrants to the United States makes a lot of sense. Mexico certainly makes a lot of sense. We have a long border with Mexico. Mexico is also fully integrated into the American economy because of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. There's another reason, though. The United States and Mexico have what is called a striking wage differential, which means the United States is pretty rich, Mexico not so much. And so equivalent work receives a much higher paycheck in the United States. So there's an incentive to leave Mexico and go to the United States. So it certainly stands to reason that Mexico would be number 1. Why China, though? China's really far. And although we are well integrated into the Chinese economy and vice versa, it's still quite a Herculean task to leave China and come all the way to the United States. It has to do with the fact that China is just the world's most populous country. And so it stands to reason that China is going to be in the top 5 as well. But Philippines makes probably no immediate sense. There's a reason, though. It's because the Philippines were once a colony of the United States. We have a lot of military bases there. And so there's a lot of connections between the United States and the Philippines, both culturally and economically, and also politically. And the result is that a lot of Filipinos who are thinking of leaving the Philippines will naturally choose the United States. India, like China, is also a very populous country, just behind China in overall population, and so it stands to reason. But Vietnam might seem a little bit of a puzzle, but it shouldn't. It has to do with the Vietnam War. Whenever you have war, it creates refugees. And refugees then often will travel to that one country that was directly involved in the war, which of course was the United States. So the Hmong population of Wisconsin, they're basically Vietnamese refugees who came to the United States under certain provisions in our immigration laws. Alright, that's all we have for this particular video. We'll move on to the third video in just a moment's time.